Okay, hello, welcome everyone. Mark Pinto here with you tonight from Phoenixville Public Library. And this is our presentation on the importance of honeybees and what we can do to protect our busy, buzzy friends. We're glad to have with us tonight, really glad to have with us tonight, Jack McMichael from the Chester County Beekeepers Association. And I hope, Jack, you'll say a little bit something about the association too during the presentation.
I will indeed.
Excellent. And please hold your questions till the very end. You'll be able to unmute yourselves then. So Jack, thanks and take it away.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. As Mark said, we're going to talk about the life of the honeybee and how all of us, or each of us individually, can help them. And just to give you a little teaser, now, this is a honeybee. This is one of my girls. That's Abigail. We'll talk more about her in a little bit. And if we don't protect the bees, this down here in the lower right corner is what we may be facing in the future. I am Jack McMichael. I am treasurer of the Chester County Beekeepers Association. I'm also a member of the board of directors, membership director, speaker, coordinator, several hats. That we are an entirely volunteer organization that was actually formed in November of 1947 and has operated continuously since then. Although we are a local bee club by name, Chester County Beekeepers Association, and you see our website on the screen there, we actually have members from as far away as Colorado, and we have between 500 and 600 members right now. So we're a fairly large organization and very active organization. Feel free to visit the website. If you look at the events calendar there, you will see that we hold monthly meetings, which these days, of course, are virtual via Zoom. And you don't need to be a member to join in our monthly meetings. They are educational based meetings. There's just a little bit of business taken care of in every meeting, but I would say 80 to 90%, 90% or more of the monthly meetings are educational in nature. So feel free to join us for those. My email is also shown on that screen. Feel free to email me if you'd like more information about the talk or the organization. I have been keeping bees for, I guess this is my 12th year now I'm heading into. And before the pandemic, I was doing between a dozen and 20 of these talks per year. Okay, so what we're going to talk about tonight is how the European honeybee is different from other bees, wasps, and hornets, the life cycle and actually career of honeybee. Honeybees have pretty defined careers throughout their lifetime, and we'll walk you through what that's. We'll talk about the life cycle and the career of the 3 different types of honeybees in a colony, being the queen, the workers, and the drones. Then we'll get into a little bit about how they communicate with each other and how they accomplish the many things that they do. One of which is pollination and food production. And so we'll delve deeper into honeybees' role in pollination and food production. And then we're going to talk about, you've probably all heard that bees are in trouble, that bee populations are in decline. And the fact of the matter is that all pollinator populations are in decline. And we're going to talk about the major factors that are contributing to those declines. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how each of us can help the bees and other pollinators to try to reverse those declining population trends. Okay, we'll start with a little bit of bee biology and anatomy. Bees, along with wasps, ants, and sawflies, are part of the order Hymenoptera of the insect class. All insects, bees like all insects, have 3 main body parts: the head, the thorax, the abdomen, and they have 6 legs. All insects have 6 legs. So people think of all insects are bugs, but not all bugs are insects. Spiders, for example, have 8 legs, so they are not insects. Bees, in comparison to flies, have long antennae and 2 pairs of wings. Flies only have a single pair of wings. There are about 4,000 species of bees native to North America, which a lot of people don't realize. And what's even more surprising to many is that honeybees are not native to North America. Honeybees were actually first brought to North America by the earliest English settlers, many of whom were farmers, and they were coming to the New World, and they brought with them plants and seeds that they intended to plant to produce the crops that they were going to rely on for food, but they had no idea what pollinators existed or how many pollinators existed here in the New World. So they brought honeybees with them in barrels in the hulls of the ships that they came over, starting in about 1622. Now, a bee's life cycle has 4 stages. Starts with an egg. Egg hatches into a larva. The larva then transitions into a pupa, and then the adult bee emerges. During the first 3 stages of its life, the egg, the larva, and the pupa, the bee spends its entire time in one of those cells. You've all seen wax, what we refer to as honeycomb, but the bees use that comb not only for storing food, but also raising their young. So an individual bee spends the first 3 stages of its life within one of those little hexagonal cells within the nest. And then after emerging from their cell, and this bullet point refers to all bees, not just honeybees. After emerging from their cell, the adult bee generally lives from anywhere as short as only 1 or 2 weeks to up to 6 months. And that can vary greatly by species, by gender, and by season, actually. And we'll talk more about that with respect to honeybees here shortly. Only female bees, wasps, hornets, all of those stinging insects, only the females have stingers and are capable of stinging, which is another point that most people don't realize. Okay, this is the European honeybee. Again, a picture of one of my girls, Abigail. They're about 3/4 of an inch long, and they have short reddish brown hair covering their entire body. And one of the easiest ways to distinguish most bees from wasps and hornets is that wasps and hornets have very little hair on their bodies, whereas most bees have a lot of hair. Honeybees have an awful lot of hair, and though you can't really see it from this picture, they even have hair on their eyeballs. Honeybees, compared to wasps and hornets, have a much thicker waist, separating their thorax and their abdomen, and thicker legs. Most wasps and hornets, the legs are perfectly round, like cylinders, even though they're segmented. But bees' legs are much thicker and wider, and they actually have what we refer to as pollen baskets on their hind legs, where they store the pollen they collect from the flower in order to bring it back to the colony, to the hive. We call them a pollen basket, but it's actually more like they have Velcro on their hind legs where they can stick the pollen in there. And honeybees actually have 5 eyes. They have the 2 complex eyes that we see, one on either side of the head, and then they have this small spot right on the top of their head that houses 3 very small, simple eyes called ocelli that are they're positioned in a triangle, and that allows them to distinguish light and movement overhead, which helps protect them from predators such as a bird that is swooping down to eat them. They can recognize that that's coming and try to take evasive action. Honeybees build the wax comb they actually produce the wax flakes in their body, in their abdomen, and then they pass it from their hind legs to their front legs, chew it up into almost like a paste-like substance, and that's how they build their wax comb, which again, they use both for storing food and for raising brood. A honeybee's entire diet comes, other than water, which of course all living creatures need, their entire diet comes from flowers. They collect the pollen from the flowers, and that's their sole source of protein. And they collect the nectar, they bring it back to the colony, turn it into honey, and that is their source of carbohydrates. Honeybees are one of the few types of bees that are what we call eusocial, meaning that multiple generations live together and share the workload, including the raising of the young. And a honeybee colony in the summertime can have as many as 80,000 bees in a single colony or single hive. One of the other things that distinguishes honeybees from all other bees, wasps, and hornets is that the entire colony lives through the winter. For all of those other bees, wasps, and hornets, either they all die off in the fall and the queen has left behind some eggs that will hatch out in the spring, or only the queen lives in hibernation through the winter and then starts laying eggs in the spring for the next generation. Bees use primarily odors and dance to communicate, and we'll take a close look at that because some of it is pretty amazing what they can communicate to each other through something like a dance. Their nest is built in a, feral or wild bees will build their nest in a hollow tree, in the walls of a building or in a man-made beehive, of course. Only the females, as I said, have stingers, and the females rarely sting. Honeybees, again, which separates them from all other bees, wasps, and hornets, is that the honeybee actually has a barb on the end of her stinger. So when she stings a large animal such as skunk, bear, or human, and tries to fly away, the barb gets caught under the skin and pulls not only the stinger, but the venom sac along with it, leaving behind some of her internal organs. So she will die within a few minutes thereafter. And some scientists will say that that's why honeybees so rarely sting, because they know that they're not really capable of that kind of logic. But the fact is that in general, bees are much less likely to sting than wasps and hornets. And among the bees, honeybees are unlikely to sting. Okay, so that's the creature that we're going to be talking about for pretty much the rest of this talk. As I said, the members of the honeybee colony are composed of many individual creatures, as many as 80,000 in the summertime. But there's also the population, the mix of the types of bees within that population varies greatly over the course of a year. Total population can go as low as 10 to 12,000 in the winter to as high as 60 to 80,000 in a single hive or colony in the summer. And that population consists of one queen. She is the only reproductive female in the colony, the only one capable of laying eggs and raising young, although she doesn't raise them herself. And she is generally the mother of all the other bees, except shortly after, when they replace the queen for whatever reason, then obviously she's not going to be the mother of all the other bees. Within that colony of up to 60,000 bees, they're going to be somewhere between 500 and 1,000 drones, which are the males, and they are there from the spring only through mid to late October. And then all of the rest of the bees in that colony are what we refer to as the female bees, which are females that aren't capable of reproducing, but they literally do all the work in the hive. And I mean all of the work, with the exception of one job that is done by the queen in the hive and one job that is done by the drones outside the hive. So they are very aptly named as worker bees. The life cycle of the honey bee, the queen lays an egg, okay, and she can lay up to 2,000 eggs a day in the summertime, often 1,500 a day, more than her body weight at the start of the day. And the reason for that is because of how short the lifespan of those worker bees are, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. She lays an egg, and regardless of whether that egg is going to develop into an adult worker bee, an adult drone, or a future queen, that egg hatches into a larvae after 3 days. And then that larvae actually has to increase in size from the time it hatches out of the egg until the adult bee emerges, increases in size 7,000 times. So it's got to do a lot of growing in a very short period of time. So every larvae is fed a substance called royal jelly for the first 3 days of that larval stage. So much so that they are fed by the nurse bees royal jelly up to 1,300 times a day. And then the nurse bees actually produce the royal jelly in their body. It's about the most nutritious food there is on earth. You can actually buy it at a health food store. You'll pay somewhere between $22 and $25 for 2 ounces of royal jelly. After 3 days of feeding the royal jelly to the larvae, the nurse bees switch the diet to what we call bee bread, which is nothing more than the pollen for protein and the honey for carbohydrates, for the rest of the larval development stage, which is another roughly 3 to 5 days. And there's one exception to that. There's one time when they don't stop feeding royal jelly and switch the diet to bee bread for those larvae. On day 9, the larvae is ready to begin to pupate. So worker bees whose wax glands have been activated put a wax cap across the top of the cell to protect the developing bee because it no longer needs to be fed until it emerges as an adult. The pupae then just spins a cocoon, just like a caterpillar spins a cocoon before going through metamorphosis and emerging as a butterfly. The same thing happens to the bee within the cell. The pupa spins a cocoon, goes through metamorphosis, and then at some point, the adult bee emerges. And what point is that? From the time the egg is first laid until the adult worker bee emerges is 21 days. Male drones take a little longer to develop, so it's 24 days from the time the egg is laid until the drone emerges. And remember, I said that the worker bees are non-reproductive, meaning that although they are a fully developed adult bee, their reproductive organs have never developed in that 21-day time frame. When the colony needs to raise a replacement queen, either because the queen has died or is sick and not well enough to lay as many eggs as is needed, or if she is dying, they know they need to raise a replacement queen. So in that case, they will take some of that larvae that they've been feeding this royal jelly to, and instead of stopping the royal jelly and switching the diet to bee bread, they continue to feed that select number of larvae, and that's usually anywhere from 6 to a dozen or so larvae. They'll continue to feed them royal jelly all the way up until the time that larvae starts to transform into a pupa. And it is only that change in diet or lack of change in diet that allows what would otherwise have been a non-reproductive female worker bee to emerge to instead a virgin queen with full reproductive capabilities emerge. And that happens not in the 21 days that it takes a worker bee to develop, but just within 16 days from the time the egg is laid. That shows the power of the nutrition from that royal jelly. Okay, so now let's talk about the career of the adult honeybees after they've emerged from their cell. Starting from the queen, as I said, there is only one per colony. After emerging from her cell, she spends a few days walking around the hive, getting fed, completing her internal development, and strengthening her flight muscles, after which she goes out and she takes a single mating flight to an area that we have come to call a drone congregation area, which is anywhere from 60 to 200 feet up in the air, where drones from other colonies go to mate with virgin queens. She knows where these areas are. She goes out there and she'll mate with several drones during that flight, and then she'll return to the hive, and within a few days she will begin laying eggs. And then, as I said, she will be laying eggs. That is her one and only job, and she will lay eggs day after day after day for the rest of her life. Once she's back in the home, she's in the hive, she's actually waited on hand and foot by a retinue of worker bees who feed her and groom her. And that's how she became to be called a queen. She is not an authority at all. She doesn't give orders. She doesn't tell any of the other members of the colony what to do. She's a queen because she's waited on hand and foot. She remains in the hive until she either dies or leaves with a swarm to start a new colony after leaving home and find another home. And then during that time, as I said, her only job is to lay eggs. Queens can live up to 7 years, but most beekeepers will intentionally replace their queen after 2 or 3 years. Most commercial beekeepers requeen their hives every single year because their egg production slowly diminishes each year. Okay, on to the drones. As I said, roughly 500 to 1,000 of them in each colony in the spring and summer months. After emerging from his cell, he also spends a few days in the hive completing his internal development and strengthening his flight muscles. Like the queen, he only has one job to do. Every day from mid-morning to mid-afternoon, the drone will fly out to those same drone congregation areas and mate with queens from other colonies. And that's ensured by the fact that when the queen flies out of her hive to mate, she flies far enough away that drones from her own colony aren't capable of flying that far. So that prevents her from inbreeding with her own sons. And back to the drones. If they're successful in that mating flight, they actually die, and otherwise they return home and try again the next day. And then in the fall, after the queen has stopped laying eggs, when no more mating needs to be done for that year, the worker bees, all the females in the hive, literally throw the drones out. They know that if they leave those drones in the hive and the drones will do no productive work, all they'll do is help consume the food that they have stored to get through the winter when there is no new food available. And rather than have the drones use up that food that they may actually need to survive the winter, they throw all the drones out. So the life of the drone is not necessarily a great one. So now let's talk about the worker bees, which are by far the vast majority. And as I said, they do all of the work in the hive other than the queen laying eggs. And they actually go through a career. And they graduate from one job to the next through their lifespan. They start with housekeeping. When a worker bee first emerges from her cell, her first job is to turn around, clean out the remains of her cocoon and other debris in her cell, and polish the cell so the queen can come along and lay another egg. She then helps any of her sisters who were unable for whatever reason to clean out their cell after they emerge as an adult. And that job lasts for the first 3 days as an adult bee. And in days 4 through 12, that is when the royal jelly is developing in her body. So her job is to feed those larvae that need to be fed up to 1,300 times a day. She starts, when she first transitions from a housekeeper to a nursemaid, she's feeding the older larvae while her glands that produce the royal jelly continue to develop fully. Once those glands are working in full, then she'll switch to feeding the youngest larvae. And then also during some of that same time and extending a little further on 16 days, some of those worker bees actually become undertakers. Bees are extremely hygienic and keep their home very neat and clean. And a bee will, if it knows it's dying or very ill, it will fly out to intentionally die outside the hive. But bees will die in the hive either because of natural causes or because a beekeeper in doing an inspection accidentally crushed some bees, which unfortunately happens just about every time a beekeeper is in the hive with that many bees in there. There are bees whose job it is, 2 or 3 bees will pick up that corpse and fly it outside of the hive to get rid of it, because they know if they leave it in the hive, bacteria and disease can get in there and spread and make other bees ill or even fatal diseases. So bees whose job it is to be an undertaker from the 3rd to 16th day of their life. Then there are those bees in days 7 to 12, the worker bees whose job it is to attend to the queen, to groom her, to feed her, make sure that she's laying properly and that everything is working smoothly in the hive. And then they transition about day 12 of their adult life to filling the cupboards and food preparation. When a forager bee goes out and collects nectar to turn into honey, she brings it back to the colony and she actually passes it mouth to mouth to one of her sister worker bees, who adds an enzyme that she's developing in her body to the nectar and deposits it in one of the cells. And that's the first process of making honey. Another bee just then comes along and fans its wings over that nectar to evaporate the moisture, to get it down to less than 18% water. And that's the entire process of making honey. Other of the worker bees in this age range will do the production of the bee bread by combining protein, the pollen for protein and the honey for carbohydrates to feed those older larvae who are no longer getting royal jelly as their food. I mentioned the bee who fans its wings to help cure the honey or cure the nectar into honey. The bees are also excellent at thermoregulation, maintaining the temperature in the colony within a very narrow range. Be it too hot or be too cold, they use their wing muscles to thermoregulate the temperature in the hive. And so there's a group of worker bees who are between 12 and 18 days of age as an adult, whose job it is to do thermal regulation. And then after day 12, many of the bees become the architects, the builders, the home maintenance. Those are the bees whose wax glands have developed, and they are producing the wax to build new comb, repair comb, etc. And then there are the security guards. Day and night, there are several honeybees guarding the entrance to the hive to protect against predators like skunks, bears, occasionally raccoons, humans, and also robber bees from other colonies who will try to come in and steal their food. So that's one of the jobs. And then lastly is the forager job, the job of going outside the hive to collect food. And that happens from their 22nd day as an adult bee up to, and you'll notice that I have 42 there in red. And there's a very specific reason for that. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have heard the expression busy as a bee. This is where that expression comes from. When the queen lays an egg in the springtime, that's going to be a worker bee 21 days later. If it happens in the spring or the summer, that worker bee lives on average no more than 6 weeks or 42 days as an adult, because she literally wears her body out, having done all of these jobs up to day 22 and then out collecting food for another 20 days. They literally wear their body out in 6 weeks. And that's where the expression busy as a bee came from. In contrast, if the queen lays an egg that will eventually be a worker bee 21 days later, in the fall, in October, for example, that worker bee, when it emerges 21 days later as an adult, will have a lifespan of as long as 6 months rather than 6 weeks, because what we call the winter bee is doing much less work than the summer bee is doing. So now let's talk about how the bees communicate. Think about what life is like in a honeybee hive, whether it's in a hollow tree or a man-made hive. First of all, there's very little open space. They will build that wax comb. They build parallel sheets of comb, leaving only enough space for the bees to pass between those sheets of comb, single file. And they build as much comb as they can in that space because they want to fill they need certain portion of it to raise the brood, and they want to fill as much as they can of the rest of that space with food to make sure they have enough food to last through the winter. It's also very crowded and very noisy in there with all the buzzing that's going on. And it's dark, very dark. In fact, it's basically pitch black inside a honeybee home. So what senses do the bees rely on to communicate? Well, I gave you a little hint earlier. Inside the hive, they rely on using their senses of smell and touch. In all their life stages, from the time it's an egg all the way up to it's an adult bee, the bees produce a unique chemical pheromone, kind of like a perfume, that indicates things such as their age, their health, and in some cases, their location. And those pheromones are transmitted within the hive either via touch, through antennas, legs, or mouth parts, spread throughout the hive. One bee to another will spread those pheromones so that the entire colony knows what's going on with all other parts of the colony. And others of the pheromones are transmitted as odors, like perfumes that waft through the colony, so that all of the bees know what's going on. And the queen's pheromones are among the strongest, and that her pheromones going through the entire colony let all of the colony residents know that mom is alive and well and where she is within the colony. They also communicate with each other inside the hive via dance. And there are actually several honeybee dances that have been observed by humans, and some have been decoded. A few have been decoded. We've actually translated the dances and know exactly what the bee is communicating when it does this dance. But other dances remain a mystery. In fact, there was one dance that was first identified 70 years. Well, now it's more than 70 years ago, but it took 70 years from the time it was first recognized that this is a very specific dance that bees do within the colony, until scientists were able to translate that dance and understand exactly what that bee was communicating by that dance. But the first dance, and that's not the one I was just talking about that took 70 years to be translated. The first one was translated, and it's what we call the waggle dance. And it was translated by Austrian ethologist Karl van Fritsch in the 1940s. And it actually earned him a Nobel Prize for translating this waggle dance. So now let's take a look at the waggle dance. First, let me make sure you can see this.
Yes.
Yes, you can?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to play this. There's no talking in it. You'll need to read the words and watch the video. And there's one point that I want you to pay particular attention to when it's actually a video showing the bees on flowers. I want you to try to identify the flowers that that bee is on and watch the bee's leg, the motion of the bee's legs as it moves across the flower, the one that's closest to the center of the screen, right about here. And that may be a little tough to do because you're also going to have to be reading the words on the screen at the same time. But if you can, pay attention to the motion of her legs. So this is the waggle dance. Okay, so here she is. Now, when she gets up here, watch her legs. Particularly when she lifts her head in a few seconds here. Right there. Okay, so this is the bee that is doing the waggle dance. So with a little photo magic, they've just basically removed the rest of the bees, but you can see that she's repeating this pattern where she's waggling or wiggling her abdomen as she goes across the comb and comes back to where she started, may turn a different direction, but every one of her dances in the same direction and for the same length of time. So every time she's dancing, she's moving in this direction, which is 270 degrees to the left of where the sun is outside the hive at that given moment. So the sun would be straight up towards the top of the screen. And she's saying, go 270 degrees to the left of the sun, 270 degrees from the sun, which is to the left. And she tells the distance by how long she's dancing, not the whole length of the dance, but the part of the dance that she is doing the waggle, which in this case is 1 second or about 750 meters when she's actually 1001, 1001, 1001, 1001. And she repeats that dance. And remember that actually all of her sisters, many of her sisters will be feeling her with their antennas, and they'll be feeling the vibration on the comb when she's doing that dance. So that's how she's communicating. She's not dancing alone, as this video is showing. All those other bees are around her, and she's communicating to them where this great source of food is that she found. So this is more like what it looks like in actuality. So what she has said to them is, based on where the sun is right now, fly 270 degrees, which would be straight to the left, for a distance of 750 meters. And that will put her sisters within about 3 feet of the source of those flowers, where it's close enough that they can see them and smell them. So where is my, I have to get back to my, So that's the waggle dance. So you can see my PowerPoint again?
Yes.
Okay, good. So now let's talk about pollination, which I think everybody probably knows. Pollination is the reproduction process in plants. The pollen from the male portion of the plant, the stamen, is transferred to the female portion of the pistil of another plant of the same species or of a different flower on that same plant. And that is how plants reproduce. Once the pollen, once the pollen is transferred from the stamen to the pistil, that allows that flower to then produce the fruit, the vegetable, the nut, and or the seeds of that plant. So that's how plants reproduce. Grains such as rice, wheat, corn, etc., and grasses and some trees, for example, evergreens, rely on the wind for pollination. They don't need animals to pollinate them. But most other food crops, other flowers, and trees rely on animals for pollination. And animal pollinators include bees, butterflies, moths, bats, birds, beetles, and a few others. So now we'll talk about the bees' role in pollination. Modern farmers have historically relied heavily on honeybees for pollination of their food crops. Why? Because the bee's entire diet comes from nothing but the flowers on those plants other than the water. So that makes them very efficient pollinators. If they're going to eat, they have to visit flowers often. Bees have existed in great numbers. In addition to the local native bees, commercial beekeepers in the United States in the 1960s owned and managed roughly 6.5 million honeybee hives. Today, unfortunately, that number has dwindled to only 2.8 million. But again, having that large number of bees that live through the winter means that as soon as flowers start to bloom in the spring, there's a great workforce of pollinators ready to go to work in the honeybee. Honeybees forage during the day, but always return to their hives each night. That's another advantage to using honeybees for pollination of food crops, because the honeybee hives are relatively easy to move and therefore they can be efficiently moved to different locations to follow the crop blooming cycle. This is migratory beekeeping. And in fact, most commercial beekeepers make much more money by moving their hives and renting them to the farmers to pollinate their crops than they do from selling honey these days. So migratory beekeeping is a huge process in terms of food production. And by monocrop agriculture, basically what that refers to is that a particular area is found to be good for growing a certain crop. And probably the biggest example of that is the Central Valley of California, which is the best place on earth for almond trees. So much so that the almond trees grown and produced, the almonds produced in the Central Valley of Southern California represent 80% of the almonds not consumed in the United States, but 80% of the almonds consumed on earth are grown in that Central Valley of California. Now that Central Valley is something like 400 miles long. So that's a huge area. But they've cleared the land and planted nothing but almond trees in that area. So any local bees in that area would thrive for the 2 weeks during the year that the almonds are in bloom, but then they would starve to death, having no other food for the rest of the year. So what has happened is that the almond growers now pay the commercial beekeepers. So of that 2.8 million hives owned by commercial beekeepers currently, over 1.5 million of those beehives are put on flatbed trucks from wherever they are in the country and driven out to the Central Valley of California for the 2-week period, end of January, beginning of February, to pollinate those almonds. Now that's great for the almond growers, boosts their production of almonds tremendously, but it's very stressful on the bees. Just the fact that being closed in their hives and put on a truck for as many as 5 or 6 days to get out there, and then a return trip of equal distance, is stressful on the bees. But the other issue is that even though it's a vast area, having that many hives in a confined or close to each other, if there are a few diseased hives those diseases can spread rapidly. So the way we have developed agriculture into this monocrop culture is very bad for the bees. So why do we need the bees? Bees are responsible for pollinating most fruits, most vegetables, and most nuts. Without bees, we would not have about 1/3 of our food, or in other words, 1 out of every 3 mouthfuls of food and drink that we consume could disappear without bees. Honeybees are responsible for about 80% of the food crop pollination in the United States. Here's an example of just some foods that we wouldn't have without the bees. Now, would all of these foods absolutely disappear if all the honeybees died? No, because the native bees would pollinate some of these. But those that would remain would become extremely expensive because they would be so scarce. And it's even worse than this. I imagine many of you watching and listening like a good hamburger or hot dog or steak. Well, of course, the honeybees don't pollinate the beef cattle, but one of the primary foods that the cattle ranchers feed their beef cattle is alfalfa, and alfalfa is pollinated by bees. And if that's not enough, for those of you that like sweets, ice cream, and other desserts, if you like chocolate, the cacao plant is pollinated by bees. So we would have much less of a lot of the foods that we all enjoy. And in terms of these foods are good for us, were it not for the bees. And that's why we need bees. So I'm sure you've all heard about the declining populations of honeybees. And in fact, all pollinator populations are in decline. And unfortunately, that is largely due to actions of humans. Honeybee colonies have been in decline worldwide for several decades. In the United States, beekeepers have lost on average 39% of their colonies each and every year since the 2010-2011 period that they studied. In Pennsylvania, for the most recent year available, Pennsylvania beekeepers have lost 43.7% of their colonies in that year. Annual winter losses, and more honeybee colonies die in the month of March by far than any other month, but the other winter months, being November through March, are when most of the losses occur. And so the annual winter losses in the US have been averaging 28.6% since 2006-2007. And it's been a fairly steady number. It's not, 28% one year and only 3% the next year and then 40% the following year. It runs right about the same every year with not a lot of variation. And in Pennsylvania, the average winter loss has been 37.5% over that same period of time since 2006-2007. So what's causing that? Well, there are many factors contributing to the worldwide decline in honeybee populations, and among them are the 3 Ps: parasites, pathogens, pesticides, poor forage, make it 4 Ps, and lack of habitat. So let's take a look at each of those. By far, the biggest issue facing honeybee health today is a parasitic mite whose scientific name, very appropriately, is Varroa destructor. This is a mite that originated in Southeast Asia and has spread worldwide, first coming to this country in 1989. And currently, every honeybee colony in the world, except for those in Australia and the least populated Hawaiian Islands, has some of these mites in the hive, doing damage to the bees. These mites feed on an organ in the bee's body that basically performs the same functions as 7 of our vital human organs. And that's what the mite feeds on. They basically consume that organ, killing the bees. And honeybees are this mite's only known host organism. And if the damage to the honeybee is caused by the mite itself, which kills bees, if that's not severe enough, we now know that those mites carry and transmit to the bees up to at least 14 different viruses that we know of, and it's probably more. Some of those viruses themselves are fatal to the bees. Some of those viruses give the bees dementia. So when they fly out to gather food. They're unable to return to the hive. So not only does that foraging bee die, but because the colony cannot gather enough food to last through the winter, the entire colony can die from those viruses that are causing dementia. Other viruses impair the development of the pupae in the cell, resulting in them emerging as adult bees that are incapable of flying. The first one that is visible to the beekeeper is something called deformed wing virus. The adult bee emerges and her wings are all shriveled up, not capable of flying, not a productive member of the colony. Only the fact is that only the strongest honeybee colonies can survive the mites and the diseases they carry. If a colony gets weakened by the mites to a certain point, there's nothing as a beekeeper that we can do to make that colony survive. So we have to work as hard as we can to keep those colonies as healthy and as strong as we can. The next P is the pesticides. Studies have identified sublethal levels of several insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides that have been found in the bodies of the honeybees, in the beeswax, and in fact in the honey itself. The relatively recent class of pesticides known as neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, have been found to have caused mass bumblebee die-offs in several different times over the last decade. There's much controversy surrounding neonics and the level of harm that they cause to honeybee health. There have been several studies showing that the neonics are indeed harmful to the honeybees and can cause death. And yet there are anecdotal studies, even fairly large-scale commercial beekeepers who have a lot of honeybee colonies right next to agricultural land that has been planted with seeds that have been treated with these neonicotinoids that don't seem to have a significant negative impact on those hives. So we're not really sure if the neonicotinoids themselves are as harmful to the bees as some studies and some people claim they are. But it's generally accepted that the honeybee's ability to fight the effects of those various diseases, most of which are transmitted by the mites, that it weakens their ability to fight those diseases, it being the various pesticides that make their way into the hive and into the bees. Next factor is poor forage. Honeybees, like most other living creatures, need a healthy diet of a variety of nutrients that are provided by different food sources. They don't like to eat all the same thing, and they need a variety of food. Three factors have resulted in significant declines in the quality and quantity of the food sources available to honeybees. First of which is the deforestation of vast areas of the planet. We think of bees as foraging on flowers, but the fact of the matter is that much of their diet comes from flowering trees, not the flowers that are short and planted in our gardens. And so with the deforestation of vast areas, we've reduced the foods available to the honeybee, both in quantity and quality. Government subsidies to our farmers to grow mostly corn and soy for biofuels instead of the variety of crops that they used to plant. Corn is a grain, so it has virtually no nutritional value for bees, and it uses wind to pollinate it. Soy is pollinated by bees, but in terms of the preference list of foods for bees, soy is very low on that list. And then last is the monocrop agriculture that we talked about. The fact that if large area, there's only one crop available, even if it's a highly nutritious crop for the bees, the fact that they're not getting the variety of nutrition from that one crop is impacting and leading to the decline in honeybee populations. And lastly, the laws of habitat. Just like the deforestation took away sources of food for the bees, it also takes away living spaces for them. And bees swarm as it's actually a natural instinct and a method of reproduction at the colony level for honeybees, not the individually. And we could certainly talk for another hour about exactly what swarming is and how it works. But swarming bees, half the bees leave in a swarm and they go out to look for a new home. And if there are fewer potential homes available, that makes it harder for them to find a home. And recent studies show that less than 20% of the 27% of the swarms will survive their first winter in their new home. And that is partially due to the lack of preferred living spaces because of the fact that we have cleared so many forests. So how can we help the bees? The best thing that any of us can do is to plant a variety of flowers and trees, preferably native flowers and trees, all season long, especially those that bloom in early spring and late summer and fall. In this part of the country, a colony of honeybees can bring in more food on any given day than they will consume that day, only from the time the first dandelions bloom in the spring to, in most years, the middle of July. So imagine if you had to do all your food shopping for your family from late April to the beginning of July, and that food had to last you until the following spring when the dandelions start to bloom again. Well, that's what life is like for honeybees. And so we need to provide, and that's the reason most honeybee colonies die in the month of March. They have run out of food and they're starving to death. So one of the best things, the best thing that any human can do to help the honeybees is to plant more flowers and flowering trees that are blooming all season long. So they have food available all year long, especially in the early spring, late summer, and fall. Take a portion of your lawn, as I am about to do, and convert it to a wildflower meadow. Grow your own fruits and vegetables. Accept and embrace weeds. You know, what we consider weeds might be an extremely important source of food for pollinators, just because we don't like it. Stop killing your dandelions is a prime example, because that is one of the first and best food sources for the bees. That was the flower that was in that video that we saw on the Wangle. Those bees were feeding on dandelions. Encourage your state and local governments to plant parks and public spaces with pollinator-friendly plants and trees. Limit or stop using your pesticides, not just insecticides. Learn how bees and 90% of all insects and other pollinators are beneficial to humans and the environment. Understand and protect honeybee swarms. Honeybee swarms are not at all dangerous. Actually, that's when they are most docile and least likely to sting. You can help the bees by buying local honey, support your local beekeeper who's doing their best to help the bees. And above all, before you become a beekeeper, do a lot of research. Actually, we are at the point that a lot of people who get into beekeeping without understanding what all is involved, how much work is involved, and what really it takes, they are doing more harm than good to the bees, because not only are they likely to kill their own bees, but because of the way the mites work and spread, the chances are that they will kill the colonies of the beekeepers around them. So spread the word. And here are some books available, probably some of these. In fact, I think I know that a couple of these are available at the Phoenixville Library that you can use to help guide you on your way. And with that, I will turn it over to questions.
Great, thanks so much, Jack. Feel free to open your, unmute yourselves at this time, or if you want, type the question into the chat.
Mark, can I rely on you to read the questions to me, only because I want to leave these books up here on the screen for those who want to copy the information down? Sure
thing. Fascinating, someone says, and yes, truly is.
They are incredible creatures, incredibly intelligent, and in fact, fascinating. And while you're collecting questions, let me just add that I mentioned very early on that the bees have hair all over their body. And what I wanted you to see in that bee on the flower is, because of the hair on their bodies, when they fly through the air, static electricity builds up in the hair on their body. So when they land on the flower, some of the pollen literally jumps onto their body. And so the bees will use their front legs to comb the pollen back to their back legs and store it in the pollen basket. And you saw a little bit of that on that bee on the dandelions in the video.
There's a question in the chat. What happens to the queen if she is replaced, if she is still alive?
They will not replace the queen when she's still alive, unless she is sick or dying, or if they are preparing to swarm, in which case they're part of that. They know that she's going to be leaving with a swarm, so they will produce replacements. They never raise just one replacement, because if something happened to that one, whether it didn't emerge as an adult properly, or was killed on its mating flight, eaten by a bird or hit by a car, the colony could not survive without a queen. So they always raise a half a dozen or dozen. And if multiples of those new queens emerge, it will be fight to the death and survival of the fittest until there's just one queen in the colony.
A lot of thank yous coming in. Great presentation, extremely interesting. Any more questions for Jack? Here we go. I'm seeing bees in the forest right now, and they do not look like honeybees. How do you differentiate?
It is tough to differentiate visibly honeybees from the, as I said, 4,000 species of bees that are native to North America. Of those 4,000 native bees, 70% of them are ground nesters. They nest in the ground, and only 30% nest in hollow trees or even hollow twigs. So if you can see where their nest is, and honeybees prefer a nest that has a small, relatively small, easily defensible opening, and generally they prefer to be at least 15 feet off the ground. That's about the only clue I can give you without, really getting into details. It's often hard for me when I see a bee to be absolutely certain. I can tell if it's a bee versus a wasp or a hornet, but if it's about the same size, 3/4 of an inch long, it can be tough to identify as a honeybee.
You mentioned European honeybees. Are there American honeybees?
There are not American honeybees. As I said, the bees we have here were first brought here by the earliest English settlers. They're known as the European honeybee or the Western honeybee because there are actually, I think, 12 species of honeybee and 24 subspecies. Probably the best known, other than the European honeybee, is the African bee or Africanized bee. And they are a honeybee. They are just a much more aggressive bee. They will defend their hive and their home much more aggressively. So if I open one of my beehives in the fall when there's no more food coming in, it's likely that 50 to 100 of those bees are going to be coming out and trying to drive me away. Not necessarily trying to sting me, but drive me away. If I had Africanized bees, instead of that number being 50 to 100, it would be a few thousand.
Do native bees pollinate plants?
Yes. All bees, butterflies, moths, birds, bats, all are pollinators. And all pollinators are in declining population. So by planting more flowers and trees, you're helping all pollinators, not just the honeybees. But they all pollinate. Actually, the mason bee or orchard bee, some people know them as, are actually more efficient pollinators than honeybees, but like all of the others, they all die off in the fall. So it takes a good while in the spring to build up a good pollinator workforce of those mason bees. Whereas the honeybees, since the entire colony is living through the winter, they got an army ready to go in pollination in the spring.
We have a comment from someone who says, also curious about a hornet's nest, got stung by about 45 bees last summer from a nest my dog found in the ground.
Yes, if it was, so don't confuse hornets and bees. Hornets and wasps are not bees. They are all stinging insects. And hornets in general are the most aggressive. And a lot of people will see what the thing that in a tree, not in the ground, that looks like a paper mache upside down pear or teardrop. And people think that's the paper wasp because it looks like the nest is made of paper mache. Actually, that is the nest of what is known as the bald-faced or white-faced hornet. And they and yellow jackets are about the two most aggressive. And yellow jackets most often build their nest in the ground, but they also build their nest in buildings and structures.
Do killer bees also create honey?
If by killer bees you are referring to the Africanized bees, which have been called killer bees because they have in fact killed, I know they've killed horses and have killed a few humans, they are a subspecies of honeybees. The news most recently has been about the giant agent hornet or killer hornet. And they produce no honey. They kill the bees. They actually feed the bees to their young. And they just came to this country within the last year, I think, when the giant agent hornet first found its way to this country. A nest of them in one of the millions of shipping containers that came into the West Coast from Asia. And there are stingless bees in the world, but none of them most of them are subtropical. So of the 4,000 bees, native bees plus the honeybees that we find and the 7,000 species of wasps and hornets, the females of all of them are capable of stinging.
Do carpenter bees also pollinate?
Yes, carpenter bees pollinate, and many people think carpenter bees don't sting because, like honeybees, they are very reluctant to do so, but the female carpenter bees are in fact capable of stinging. And they pollinate as well, not nearly as much as honeybees. And the major reason for that is most of those other bees and wasps and hornets, they're gathering pollen and nectar only enough to leave behind for the eggs that they're laying. So when that egg hatches into a larvae, there is food available for it. Whereas the honeybees have to collect all the food that entire colony of thousands of bees are going to need for 8 months to live on. So that's why the honeybees have to do that much more pollinating during the relatively short period of time that the flowers are in bloom and that they can gather food from them.
Great questions coming in too.
Yes.
And yeah, someone says, thank you for an awesome presentation.
Thank you for allowing me to share my passion about the bees and how much we need them.
Susan? Didn't you let her
Someone
know?
unmuting? Go ahead. And someone unmuting to ask a question? Okay, guess not. But thank you. Thanks, Jack. Really great information, and I hope
Thank you all.
you folks got some good advice on what we need to do to protect these guys.
So I see somebody just put in the chat which bee creates a perfectly round hole. If that perfectly round hole is in wood, that's a carpenter bee, and that's why they're called the carpenter bee, because they chew a tunnel in that hole in that wood to lay their eggs in to raise the young. Well, again, I thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Jack. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Have a great rest of your night now.
Take care.
All right, take care now. Bye-bye.